At 5:12 in the morning, before the first tourists arrived, before the cafes opened, before the marble of St. Peter's Square warmed under the Roman sun, a Swiss guard found a single white sneaker near the barricade. It was small, too small for a grown man. The rubber on one side had melted. The laces were blackened. On the outer sole, written in permanent marker, were two words: no future. No one knew who had left it there. No camera had caught the owner's face clearly. The footage showed only a blur of young bodies running through smoke the night before, a line of police lights flashing blue against Bernini's columns, and then, for 11 seconds, the image went white. Smoke. A flare. Flare. A stone. A screw. Screw. Then the square came back into focus, and the shoe was there. Alone. By 5:40, the object was carried through a side entrance and placed on a plain wooden bench outside the papal chapel. Not on Pope Leo XIV's desk. Not inside a file, not under a red seal, just there, in the silence before morning prayer, where anyone passing could see it. The Pope stopped when he saw it. He did not ask who owned it. He did not ask who had brought it. He did not ask whether the protest had been Catholic, political, organized, spontaneous, foreign, local, left-right, religious, secular, or simply desperate. He looked at the burned lace. Then he looked at the words, "No future," and for almost a full minute, Pope Leo XIV said nothing. Those who knew him understood the silence. He had seen this before, not in Rome only, but in poor neighborhoods, in mission towns, in countries where young people grew up surrounded by corruption, unemployment, police violence, broken promises, and screens that showed them every luxury they could never touch. He had seen the same fire in different eyes. In Lima, in Santiago, in Paris, in Gaza, in New York, in the outskirts of cities where hope had been priced out of reach. At 6:03, the Pope entered the chapel. At 6:41, he came out. At 7 o'clock, he canceled the morning briefing. At 7:26, the Vatican communications team received a short instruction from his secretary. Open transmission. No studio. No palace background. No prepared audience. At 8:15, phones across the world began receiving a live alert. Pope Leo XIV would speak directly to the youth of the world. Not to condemn them. Not to flatter them. To warn them. For clarity, what follows is a dramatized Vatican-style documentary scenario built from the text provided. It is not a verified news bulletin. It is a cinematic reflection on youth, violence, manipulation, creativity, leadership, and the difficult choice between burning the world down and building something worthy of tomorrow. When the camera came on, Pope Leo XIV was not standing beneath gold. He sat in a small room with a crucifix on the wall, a glass of water beside him, and the burned sneaker on the floor beside his chair. He looked tired, but not weak. There was ash on the world, and he intended to speak before the ash became destiny. "My children," he said, "I have seen the flame in your eyes." That was the line that stopped the feeds. Across continents, in cafes, dorm rooms, subway stations, refugee tents, church basements, and riot-damaged streets, young people looked up. He did not begin with accusation, he began with recognition. "I know why you are angry," he continued. "I know the sound of doors closing before you have even knocked. I know the humiliation of being told to wait by people who stole your future before you were old enough to vote. I know the rage that rises when corruption wears a suit, when violence wears a uniform, when poverty is treated like a personal failure, and when the powerful call your pain disorder." He paused. But anger is fire, and fire can warm a home, or it can burn the children inside it. The first warning came slowly, not as a slogan, as a diagnosis. Violence never gives birth to justice. The words moved faster than the broadcast delay. They appeared on screens, subtitles, social feeds, news tickers, and private chats. Some mocked them instantly, others repeated them. A few young men, standing in a smoke-filled avenue thousands of miles from Rome, lowered the bricks in their hands without knowing why. Pope Leo XIV leaned forward. "You can break windows," he said. "You can overturn cars. You can fill the night with smoke. You can make governments tremble for a few hours. But when morning comes, what will be left? A poor shopkeeper sweeping glass from the floor. A mother afraid to take her child to school. A bus stop burned by people who needed the bus. And the powerful, the truly powerful, still behind their gates. It was not a defense of injustice. It was an indictment of false rebellion. The Pope named what many young people already suspected, but had not wanted to admit. Destruction usually falls hardest on those who already have the least. When a neighborhood burns, he said, it is rarely the palace that burns first. It is the pharmacy. It is the corner store. It is the clinic. It is the door of the woman who was already struggling to pay rent. You wanted to strike the system, but the system had insurance. Your neighbor did not. That sentence traveled like a blade. In Rome, Vatican producers watched comment threads explode. Some youth channels called him out of touch. Others said, for the first time, someone had spoken to their rage without insulting their intelligence. Leo XIV did not soften the warning. Violence feels powerful because it is immediate. Love feels weak because it is patient. But history is not changed by what flashes for one night. History is changed by what remains after the smoke clears. To understand why this mattered, you have to go back to the images that had filled the previous week. Paris with flames climbing apartment walls. Santiago with students running through tear gas. Gaza, where ruins looked less like streets and more like open wounds. New York, where shattered glass glittered under police lights, as if the city itself had broken into fragments. The videos were different, but the faces were the same. Young, exhausted, furious. Online commentators tried to sort them into categories. Activists, criminals, revolutionaries, extremists, victims, threats, tools, heroes, enemies. Pope Leo XIV refused those easy names. They are not a problem to be managed, he told his aides before the broadcast. They are a generation asking whether anyone still believes in them. His first message was therefore not against protest. It was against the lie that violence is the purest form of protest. He spoke of Martin Luther King Jr., not as a statue, but as a strategist of the soul. A man who understood that non-violence was not passivity, but disciplined courage. He spoke of Gandhi, who faced an empire without becoming the mirror of the empire's brutality. He spoke of anonymous young people who had done what cameras rarely reward. Cleaned neighborhoods after riots, protected strangers from mobs, opened food banks, built shelters, tutored children, organized legal aid, and refused the narcotic of revenge. The history of justice, the Pope said, has always needed young people willing to suffer for truth. But suffering for truth is not the same as making others suffer because you are angry. Then he looked down at the shoe beside him. The camera followed his gaze. This was found near St. Peter's at dawn, he said. I do not know who wore it. I do not know whether that young person came here to pray, to protest, to film, to shout, or to run, but I know what was written on it. The camera moved closer. No future. Leo XIV let the words stay on screen. This, he said, is the true crisis, not a broken window, a broken imagination, a generation that has been told again and again that tomorrow belongs to someone else. Then came the second warning, and this one struck harder. Do not let yourselves become chess pieces in a political game. Inside the Vatican press room, several journalists exchanged looks. This was where the documentary changed shape. The emotional father became the investigator. The pastor began exposing the machinery behind the fire. Your pain is real, Pope Leo XIV said. But there are people who study your pain, package your pain, fund your pain, and weaponize your pain. There are people who do not see you as sons and daughters. They see you as movement, as pressure, as leverage, as numbers, as footage, as chaos that can be directed. He did not name parties. He did not name governments. He did something more dangerous. He described the pattern. He spoke of slogans printed before protests began, of anonymous accounts pushing rage at exactly the right hour, of organizations that disappeared when arrests happened, of donors who loved images of rebellion but never visited the injured, of leaders who urged young bodies into confrontation from safe rooms far away. They tell you to run toward the barricade, he said. They do not run with you. The line hit social media like a match dropped into gasoline. Within minutes, young people began posting stories. A student in Buenos Aires wrote that a party leader had promised legal help, then vanished after arrests. A girl in Madrid said her protest group had been fed talking points from people she had never met. A young man in Manila wrote, I thought I was part of a movement. I was part of someone's campaign. The hashtag began in Spanish, then English, then French, then Tagalog, then Arabic. Hashtag no soy peon. I am not a pawn. The Pope watched none of it in real time. He kept speaking. If someone asks you to burn your own neighborhood, he said, ask where they live. If someone asks you to risk prison, ask whether their children are standing beside you. If someone hands you rage, ask what they gain when you spend it. This was not cynicism.
It was
Freedom, Leo XIV said, does not mean doing whatever anger demands. Freedom means refusing to let another man write your conscience. In the Curia, not everyone liked this part. Some officials feared he was encouraging suspicion. Others worried that political leaders would accuse the Vatican of interference. But Leo XIV was not calling young people away from action. He was calling them away from being consumed. Do not become a rented flame, he said. A flame that belongs to another person will always burn where they point it. Become light. Light cannot be owned. At 8:53, the Vatican switchboard logged an unusual spike in calls from youth ministries, bishops' conferences, Catholic universities, secular journalists, and even civic organizations asking whether the Pope would release the full text. There was no full text. That was part of the shock. He was speaking from notes, yes, but not from a polished diplomatic paper. The broadcast had the immediacy of a man who had spent the night looking at a burned sneaker and asking what the church owed to a generation on the edge. Then came the third warning. It did not begin with warning language. It began with permission. You are allowed to be indignant, he said. A strange silence followed across the live feeds. Do not let anyone tell you that Christian peace means pretending wounds do not exist. Indignation can be holy when it rises from love. Christ was indignant at hypocrisy. The prophets were indignant at oppression. The mothers of the poor are indignant when systems crush their children. Your indignation is not the enemy. Then his voice sharpened. But indignation must be converted. If it is not converted, it becomes poison. And poison does not only kill the enemy, it kills the vessel that carries it. The third message was this: transform your indignation into creativity. That sentence, more than any other, changed the emotional temperature of the broadcast. The first warning had confronted violence. The second had exposed manipulation. The third opened a door. Your anger is raw material, Pope Leo XIV said. Do not throw it into the street like waste. Forge it, shape it, pray over it, organize it, study it, sing it, paint it, build from it. Then he gave examples, not abstractions. A neighborhood in Medellin that replaced gang retaliation with music workshops. Students in Nairobi who turned fury over unemployment into a cooperative that trained young mechanics. Teenagers in Manila who cleaned flood canals after losing friends to dirty water. Young activists in Europe who created legal clinics instead of street fights. A group in Beirut that rebuilt a library shelf by shelf after an explosion because they believed a people who read together would not be so easily trained to hate. Creativity, he said, is indignation disciplined by hope. The phrase spread. Hashtag creo en la creatividad. I believe in creativity. For an American audience, commentators called it the moment the Pope reframed rage. For Catholic viewers, it sounded older than social media. It sounded like the gospel logic of redemption, pain transformed, not denied. Leo XIV continued, the world has taught you to measure impact by noise. But the kingdom of God often begins in quiet places. A tutoring table, a community garden, a neighborhood clinic, a song written in a basement, a small fund for rent assistance, a mural that tells the truth without burning the street where children play. Then he looked straight into the camera. The rage that gives you headlines may leave you empty. The work that gets ignored may save a life. It was not glamorous. That was the point. A stone thrown in anger is seen immediately. A classroom built in patience may take years to be noticed. But one leaves injury. The other leaves heirs. Inside the Vatican, the communications team began receiving videos from cities where protests had been underway. Young people sitting in circles. Young people writing on cardboard. Young people arguing, crying, planning, some still angry, but now speaking differently. One clip from Santiago showed a teenager standing before a burned bus shelter. He held up a sign that read, "Tomorrow, we repair this." Another from Paris showed young volunteers painting over hateful slogans with the words, "Not ashes, bread." A group in New York uploaded a video. We were going downtown to smash. We stayed home and started a mutual aid map. Not everyone believed it. Some called it propaganda. Some said nothing would change. Some said the Pope was giving poetry to people who needed policy. But Leo XIV had never claimed poetry was enough. He was doing something else. He was removing the spiritual permission that allows despair to disguise itself as courage. You are not weak because you refuse to destroy, he said. You are strong because you can feel fire and still choose what to do with it. The fourth warning followed naturally. The Pope lifted his hand slightly, as if to slow a wave. The world does not need furious masses, he said. It needs leaders with vision. This line made many uncomfortable. Young people distrust leaders for good reason. Many had watched leaders betray them, flatter them, sell them, radicalize them, abandon them, and then use their images in fundraising campaigns. The word itself felt contaminated. The Pope knew that, so he defined leadership again. I do not mean the leader who uses people, he said. I do not mean the leader who lives for applause, followers, control, or power. I mean the leader who can turn a scream into a plan, the leader who can turn grief into service, the leader who can sit with enemies at the same table without selling the truth. A crowd can fill a square. A leader can keep the square from becoming a graveyard. A crowd can shout a demand. A leader can translate the demand into law, structure, school, clinic, job, meal, reform, shelter, reconciliation. A mob can break a wall, Leo XIV said. A leader must know what to build where the wall once stood. He spoke of Nelson Mandela, who carried the wound of prison without making revenge, the architecture of the nation. He spoke of Saint Teresa of Calcutta, whose leadership did not come from office, but from unglamorous fidelity to the dying. He spoke of teachers in poor districts, nurses in war zones, student organizers who stayed after the cameras left. Then he said something that made the Vatican officials behind the camera stand very still. Some of the greatest leaders of the next century are watching this on cracked phone screens right now. It sounded like a blessing. It was also a summons. You do not need permission from the old world to begin building the new one, he said. But you do need discipline. You need truth. You need prayer. You need study. You need communities that can correct you. You need elders who do not control you and peers who do not worship you. Vision without humility becomes tyranny. Passion without formation becomes chaos. This was where the Pope's missionary past showed. He knew that youth movements can die not only from repression, but from ego. The charismatic speaker, the viral account, the organizer who starts loving his image more than the people, the activist who cannot listen, the spiritual leader who confuses intensity with holiness. Be careful, he warned. Many people begin as servants of justice and end as owners of a brand. That line was clipped millions of times. Influencers hated it. Some quoted it anyway. The Pope pressed on. Leadership is not standing above people. Christ showed us this. On the night before he died, he did not seize a throne. He took a towel. He washed feet. Any leadership that cannot kneel is not Christian leadership. Any revolution that cannot serve will become another empire. The hashtag shifted again. Hashtag Yoguiare. I will guide. But in the script of that moment, Leo XIV refused romanticism. Do not write I will guide unless you are willing to be corrected, he said. Do not call yourself a leader if you cannot apologize. Do not gather people if you do not love them when they disagree with you. The world does not need more chiefs intoxicated with their own voices. It needs men and women with vision, patience, moral courage, and clean hands. Across the world, youth groups began pausing protests to hold assemblies. Some were chaotic, some were beautiful, some were probably symbolic more than practical. But the idea had landed. Protest could become proposal. Outrage could become organization. Grief could become governance. Then came the fifth warning, the heart of the speech. The sentence that would appear the next morning on front pages from Rome to Manila, from Nairobi to Buenos Aires, from Washington to Warsaw. True strength is not destroying. True strength is building. Pope Leo XIV did not rush this line. He let it breathe. Then he repeated it. True strength is not destroying. True strength is building. The burned sneaker remained in frame. For the first time, he picked it up. He held it with both hands. Whoever wore this, he said, may have thought the world was already over. Perhaps he ran from police. Perhaps she ran from smoke. Perhaps the shoe belongs to a child who came only to watch and was swallowed by the chaos. I do not know. But I know this: no young person should have to write no future on the thing that carries them forward. He lowered the shoe. My children, I refuse to believe that this is the final message of your generation. The room seemed to tighten. The Pope's voice did not rise, but its force deepened. The world has told you that rage is power. The gospel tells you that creation is power. God looked upon chaos and did not answer with more chaos. He said, "Let there be light." That is your mission, not to imitate the destroyer, to imitate the creator. This was the theological center of the entire broadcast. Violence is easy to film. Construction is slow. Violence produces immediate evidence: flames, broken glass, noise, fear. Construction often looks boring at first. Meetings, budgets, cleaning, teaching, planting, forgiving, returning, trying again. But the Pope insisted that this is precisely why construction is holy. Anyone can destroy in one night what took years to build, he said. But only a soul trained in hope can build something that will bless people he may never meet. He painted a series of images: a young woman choosing to study medicine because her brother died waiting for treatment, a former gang member teaching boys how to repair bicycles instead of stealing them, a group of students turning an abandoned lot into a garden, a daughter forgiving her father and breaking a generational curse, a young engineer designing flood-resistant homes, a musician writing songs that give language to grief without glorifying revenge, a priest opening a parish hall for dialogue after a riot, a non-believing student organizing food deliveries because hunger does not ask for a baptismal certificate. These, Leo XIV said, are not small things. They are the bricks of civilization. The phrase became the title of thousands of posts. Bricks of civilization. For those watching closely, the investigative element of the speech did not disappear. It sharpened. The Pope began naming the false economy of destruction. Destruction creates markets, he said. Do not be naive. Broken cities create contracts. Broken youth create careers. Broken trust creates surveillance. Broken neighborhoods create profitable fear. There are people who benefit when you destroy what you need. There are industries that grow fat from your despair. This was the exposé beneath the sermon. Violence is not only a moral failure, it is an economy. It feeds media cycles, political campaigns, security budgets, extremist recruitment, advertising engagement, and the careers of those who sell panic. Ask yourself, he said, who profits when you lose hope? No answer came from the room. The question was enough. He then turned the question inward. And who is blessed when you build up? The child who learns to read, the elder who feels safe, the refugee who finds a door open, the addict who finds a hand instead of a lecture. The neighborhood that discovers it can solve one problem without waiting for someone powerful to arrive. The church that remembers it exists not to watch history, but to heal it. At this point, the Vatican feed showed a split screen prepared by no one. It happened because networks around the world began pairing the Pope's words with local footage. Burned cars next to youth cleaning sidewalks, smashed windows next to volunteers boarding them up, shouting crowds next to circles of prayer. The contrast became the story. Not youth as threat, youth as decision. The generation could burn, or the generation could build. But the Pope knew emotion. Emotion would not last, so he made the call practical. Within the next 40 days, he said, I ask every diocese, every parish, every school, every youth movement, and every community of goodwill to create one concrete work of construction, not a slogan, not a post, a work. Repair a home, open a table, start a tutoring circle, clean a street, visit a prison, reconcile two groups, plant a garden, create a fund, protect a child, build something that remains. The Vatican later called it the 40 days of building. The Pope did not. He simply said, give your anger a task. That line may have been the most important of all. Anger without a task becomes fire. Anger with a task can become justice. The aftermath began before the broadcast ended. Newsroom. Scrambled. Political commentators tried to claim the Pope for their side. Some said he had condemned the radical left. Others said he had exposed state manipulation. Some conservatives praised his rejection of riots, until he criticized systems that crush the poor. Some progressives praised his compassion for youth, until he condemned violence and ideological manipulation. Everyone wanted a fragment, but the whole message refused captivity. That was Leo XIV's genius. He did not say the youth were innocent. He did not say the powerful were innocent. He did not say anger was evil. He did not say order was justice. He did not bless rage. He did not bless repression. He said something harder. Conversion is required on every side. In the Curia, reactions were mixed. Some officials praised the speech as pastoral brilliance. Others worried that it would encourage youth organizing outside traditional church structures. One senior prelate reportedly complained, "The Holy Father has just asked every young Catholic to become a social architect." A younger bishop answered, "Good. They were never meant to be spectators." Traditional Catholic commentators focused on the Pope's warnings against destruction. Progressive Catholic channels highlighted his defense of anger rooted in injustice. Secular media fixated on the anti-manipulation language. Youth accounts made memes out of "give your anger a task." Within 24 hours, the hashtags crossed language barriers. #peace, #soy libre, #creo en la creatividad, #yo guiare, #construir esfuerza, #bricks of civilization, #give your anger a task. In Nairobi, a youth group repaired a school wall covered in political graffiti and painted a mural of hands holding bricks. In Manila, students created a flood response volunteer map. In Bogota, young people who had been part of street clashes organized a legal clinic for families affected by arrests and violence. In Warsaw, Catholic and non-Catholic students held a public forum on manipulation, propaganda, and civic responsibility. In New York, a group of teenagers started a weekend program called Not Ashes, cleaning local parks and connecting residents to food resources. In Gaza, where survival was more urgent than symbolism, a group of young volunteers shared a short video from inside a damaged building. They had salvaged a blackboard from the rubble. On it, in English, they wrote, "We build because we are still alive." That image reached the Pope 2 days later. He reportedly wept, but not all reactions were tender. Some activist groups accused him of trying to pacify righteous anger. Some political operatives attacked him for exposing manipulation tactics. Some governments welcomed the message publicly, while privately monitoring youth groups with renewed suspicion. Some influencers were furious that young people began asking who funded their campaigns. The most revealing reactions came from those who tried to reduce the message to a single sentence. Leo XIV resisted every reduction. In his Sunday Angelus, he returned to the theme. "I did not ask the young to be quiet," he said. "I asked them to be free. I did not ask them to stop demanding justice. I asked them to stop handing their souls to violence. I did not ask them to stop being angry. I asked them to make their anger fruitful." The crowd in St. Peter's Square was smaller than during the broadcast, but the response was strong. He continued, "A society that tells its young people to calm down without listening to their wounds is unjust. A movement that tells young people to burn without giving them a future is cruel. The Church must choose a different path. We must listen, guide, correct, and build with them." Then he announced a new initiative. Not a document, not a bureaucracy, a network. The Vatican would invite youth representatives from conflict zones, poor neighborhoods, universities, rural communities, refugee camps, and digital communities to gather in Rome for what he called the Assembly of Builders. The name mattered. Not an assembly of rebels, no, not an assembly of victims. Builders. The purpose would be practical: to gather testimonies, identify forms of manipulation, train young leaders in nonviolent action, support creative civic projects, and connect parishes with youth-led initiatives that rebuild rather than destroy. The old Vatican bureaucracy wanted to shape it into a conference. Leo XIV insisted it begin differently. No opening banquet, no VIP seating. The first session would begin in silence, with one object placed at the center of the room: the burned sneaker. Some officials thought this too theatrical. The Pope disagreed. "The Church forgets when it abstracts," he said. "Let them look at the shoe." The Assembly of Builders became the second act of the story. Young people arrived from places that rarely share a room. A girl from Paris, who had watched her neighborhood burn. A student from Chile, who had been arrested in a protest, a young man from Gaza who had lost family members, a Ukrainian volunteer who had built shelters, a Black American organizer from New York, working against neighborhood violence, a Filipino climate activist, a Kenyan engineer, a Polish seminarian, a Brazilian street artist, a Syrian teacher, a Mexican catechist. They did not agree on everything. That was the point. They were not gathered to create a mood. They were gathered to practice a discipline. The first day, an argument broke out over whether property destruction could ever be justified. The room grew tense. A few participants walked out. The old pattern was returning. Then one of the facilitators, a quiet nun from South Sudan, lifted the burned shoe and placed it on the table. "Before you speak again," she said, "tell us who will wear this when the argument is over." The room went silent. That was the method. Return to the wounded person. Return to the future that has to be carried by someone. Over 5 days, the group drafted what later became known as the Builders' Covenant. It was not an encyclical. It had no doctrinal weight, but it spread because it was clear. We refuse violence that destroys the poor first. We refuse manipulation by hidden powers. We accept indignation as energy for creative action. We commit to leadership as service, not control. We will build works that remain after the cameras leave. We will let truth correct us. We will choose light over fire. Pope Leo XIV received the covenant in a simple meeting. No stage, no applause. He read it slowly. Then he added one sentence by hand. "We build because Christ rose from ruins." That became the final line. In the weeks that followed, bishops began reporting unexpected changes. Confessors said young people were coming not only to confess violent acts, but to ask how to repair damage. Pastors said youth groups wanted budgets, spaces, mentorship, and training, not just permission to meet. Catholic schools developed courses on civic courage, propaganda, social ethics, nonviolent action, and community design. Secular groups asked to partner with parishes, not because they had suddenly converted, but because the church had made itself useful without demanding ownership of the movement. That last point mattered. Leo XIV warned against spiritual branding. If the church helps youth build, he said, she must not put her logo on their conscience. The line irritated communications officials. It delighted young people. The Pope understood something Guant institutions often forget. Young people can smell exploitation even when it is dressed in piety. If the church tried to use their pain to improve her image, she would become one more manipulator. If she walked beside them without stealing their voice, she might regain credibility. The investigations continued too. Catholic journalists and secular researchers began tracing networks behind violent mobilizations. Some findings were predictable. Partisan groups, extremist cells, foreign influence accounts, monetized outrage channels. Others were more subtle. Advertising systems that rewarded escalation, platforms that pushed the angriest content, because anger kept users online, fundraising pages with no transparency, influencers staging confrontations for views. The Pope's second warning had opened a door. The question, "Who profits when you lose hope?" became investigative language. Young Catholics began creating media literacy guides. Youth ministers learned to teach not only prayer, but discernment in digital spaces. Bishops who once dismissed social media as a distraction now recognized it as a battleground for souls. But the Pope never let the story become purely political. At the heart of everything remained conversion. In a homily at Santa Marta, he said, "The violent young person must be corrected, yes, but the comfortable adult must also repent. The manipulated youth must wake up, yes, but the manipulator must answer before God. The angry generation must learn to build, yes, but the older generation must ask why so many children had to write 'no future' before anyone listened." That line moved the burden outward. This was not youth versus elders. This was a wounded body trying to remember how to heal. The final scene of the documentary returns to the square. 40 days after the broadcast, St. Peter's Square filled again. But this time there were no barricades of fear. There were long tables built from plain wood. On each table lay objects sent by young people from around the world. One brick from a rebuilt school in Syria. A paintbrush from a mural in Nairobi. A repaired bicycle chain from a workshop in Manila. a notebook from a tutoring circle in the Bronx, a seed packet from a community garden in Lima, a candle from a vigil in Warsaw, a small piece of glass collected from a shop window in Paris, now placed in a frame with the words, "We repaired what we broke." At the center, beneath a simple crucifix, was the burned sneaker. Not hidden, not glorified, remembered. Pope Leo XIV walked slowly between the tables. He touched no object at first. He simply looked. Like a pastor counting wounds, like a father seeing that some of his children had chosen not to disappear into fire. When he finally spoke, his voice was low. "My children," he said. "The world tried to tell you that you were a generation of ashes. Today you have answered with bricks." Applause rose, but he lifted his hand. "Do not applaud too quickly. A brick is not a building. A beginning is not a conversion completed. You must continue. You must organize. You must forgive. You must study. You must pray. You must serve. You must resist manipulation. You must resist despair. You must resist the temptation to become the thing you hate." Then he picked up the burned sneaker one last time. "The first time I saw this," he said, "I saw two words. No future. Today I ask you to write two different words, not on shoes, not on walls, not only online, but with your lives." He paused. "Build tomorrow." The square answered not with a chant at first, but with silence. Then, one by one, young people began repeating it. "Build tomorrow. Build tomorrow. Build tomorrow." The phrase moved outward through the crowd, then through phones, then through the world. Leo XIV blessed them, not as a commander sending soldiers into battle, as a pastor sending builders into ruins. The camera pulled back. St. Peter's Square looked smaller from above than it felt from the ground. One square. One city, one old church, one wounded generation, and somewhere in the center, a burned shoe that no longer said the final word. Because the final word was not fire, not rage, not manipulation, not despair. The final word was a task. Build. And if this story has reached you, wherever you are watching from, write your city and your country in the comments. Tell us what you are building, even if it is small. Share this with someone who feels angry, used, or hopeless. Subscribe for more documentary-style stories about faith, power, truth, and the choices that shape history. And remember this, the world may hand you ashes, but God can still teach your hands to build. After the official cameras faded, one more thing happened that most viewers never saw. A young man remained near the last wooden table after the crowd had begun to leave. He wore no collar, no flag, no movement logo. His jacket smelled faintly of smoke. One of the volunteers later said, he had been standing there for almost 20 minutes, staring at the framed piece of glass from Paris. Pope Leo XIV noticed him. Security moved slightly closer. The Pope raised one hand and stopped them. The young man did not kneel. He did not ask for a blessing. He simply said, in a voice so low that only those nearby heard it, "Holy Father, what if I already destroyed too much?" Leo XIV looked at him for a long time. Then he answered, "Then begin by repairing one thing." The young man shook his head. "One thing is not enough." No, the Pope said. "But one thing is how mercy enters history." That sentence became the hidden ending of the day, passed quietly from volunteer to volunteer until it reached the Vatican press room and then the world. It completed the message better than any official statement could have done, because the Pope was not asking a generation to solve every crisis before sunset. He was asking them to reject the lie that because they could not fix everything, they were free to destroy anything. He was asking them to understand that repair is not weakness. Repair is rebellion against despair. And this is where the story leaves the marble of Rome and enters ordinary life. A young woman apologizes to the shopkeeper whose door she helped break. A student asks who is funding the account that keeps telling him to hate. A parish youth group opens its hall for debate instead of denunciation. A teacher chooses not to mock angry students, but to train them in civic courage. A bishop stops issuing statements about youth and starts eating with them. A family turns off the endless feed of outrage and asks what one neighbor needs tonight. None of this trends for long, but the kingdom of God rarely begins as a trend. It begins as yeast, as salt, as a lamp, as a seed, as one person refusing to hand his soul to the machinery of rage. That is why the burned sneaker remains such a powerful image. It does not accuse only the young. It accuses every system that made them feel disposable. It accuses every adult who confused silence with peace. It accuses every politician who used youth as fuel. It accuses every church community that condemned the fire without asking who had left the children freezing. And still, the shoe does not end in accusation. It ends in mission. Because a shoe is made for walking, not burning, not being displayed forever. Walking. So the final question is not whether young people are angry. They are. Often for good reason. The question is where that anger will walk next. Toward the next fire, or toward the first brick,